God, the most merciful, the most compassionate. May God's blessings be upon His Prophet. It is my honor to moderate this session. It is the third session in the seventh gathering of the Forum for the Promotion of Peace. And the title of this session is Human Values in Times of Crises. As we all know, crises can lead to people getting together and showing solidarity, and many of these values are there and they are taken from religions. And in this very unique crisis, a crisis with a very unique nature, is leading us to look at how humanity is coping and how humanity needs the common values. We are going to look at very special values like solidarity, compassion, the need for support. And we are also going to look at the step that is being taken by the new alliance of virtues, which is launched by His Excellency Sheikh Ben Baya. This new alliance represents truly the spirit of the ship's passengers, and it could be a new social contract that could help the world to overcome its current crises. And this session is honored to have several speakers, and there is a common ground between them, and that is they are all contributing either through their positions or through their writings, the research. They are acting as bridges between religions, civilizations, and cultures. We are in dire need of the contributions of such speakers. I'm going to start with the first speaker, who is Dr. Ibrahim Mashrouh. He is a professor of philosophy and logic in Dar al Hadith Al Hassaniya Institute, and he is the editor-in-chief of the Peace magazine in Morocco. It is the first magazine in the Arab world that is specialized in this subject. He is specialized in the culture of getting to know one another. You have 15 minutes, sir, for your presentation, so you have the floor. Go ahead.
Am I to speak?
دكتور إبراهيم مشروح.
So, Dr. Ibrahim Mashrouh.
I'm sorry, do I start?
تفضلوا. You can.
Oh, thank you. I'm speaking less about the pandemic and more about the virtues. I do so because the virtues as a way to think about peace and in particular ethics comes at a very interesting time in the West. Until recently, the virtues were not at the center of the study of ethics in the West. The alternatives in ethics were thought to be either utilitarianism or deontological theories. The former was primarily identified with John Stuart Mill. The deontological alternative was associated with the work of Immanuel Kant, who provided what many people thought was the most persuasive account of what was assumed to be the only alternative to Mill. But both accounts assumed that the primary moral subject was the individual. Interestingly enough, Both these alternatives made decision and choice the focus of what was thought to be ethics. Ethics became the analysis of hard decisions shaped by questions of what would you do in X or Y circumstances. Questions of the ethics of peace and the ethics of war were shaped by these alternatives. The general presumption was peace is some ideal that is an unrealistic goal given the realities of our time. The only exception was Kant's late essay on perpetual peace, in which he tried to show that liberal societies shaped by the freedom of the individual would negotiate with other free societies, making war less likely, but also continuing needed to be a necessity. One of the implications of this way of doing ethics is that the voice of the people of faith was basically lost. The Christian tradition's emphasis upon Jesus and what it meant to be a disciple was left underdeveloped. The Catholic tradition emphasized the importance of natural law, which was primarily identified with principles as the character of morality. This emphasis betrayed Thomas Aquinas' ethics, which was primarily shaped by virtue. I will return to that comment in a minute. I've recounted this history because it makes clear what a dramatic development the reintroduction of the virtues in the discussions of ethics in the West has been. That development began with the work of Wittgenstein and was elaborated by Elizabeth Anscombe. She was quite a figure, accusing Oxford philosophers such as Hare of corrupting the youth. She opposed the granting of a degree to Harry Truman on grounds that he was a war criminal. But the breakthrough book was Alasdair MacIntyre's After Virtue. MacIntyre argued that the current ethical theories that were determining what ethics was about in the West were reflections of a moral incoherence of liberal social orders. If there was to be renewal of ethics and the formation of people in the virtues, he argued would require an introduction of the work of Aristotle and the emphasis upon the need for habituation under the guidance of masters. The significance of MacIntyre's book, which was published in 1972, was and is extremely important. His book was quite simply a changer of the discussion. He argued that the choice before the West was Nietzsche or Aristotle. He admired Nietzsche for the exposing of the emptiness of the West, but he chose Aristotle as the great conversation partner for the future. The recovery of the ethics of virtue, therefore, went hand in hand with the recovery of Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics. It received the attention it deserved, a result that I assume is of real interest to Islamic scholars, with the emphasis in Islam on Aristotle's place. MacIntyre's influence was first and foremost among philosophers. I was the theologian who, even before MacIntyre began to recover the importance of the virtues that displayed the kind of lives commensurate with our faith in God through the virtues. I began that project in my dissertation, which had discussions of Aristotle, Rudolf Bultmann, and Karl Barth. I tried to show that Barth, more than Bultmann, the classical Protestant liberal, had resources for recovery of the virtues. In particular, Barth's Christology meant that an account of the virtues could be developed for what it meant to follow Jesus. And inherent to that project was an emphasis upon the necessity of the story that captures us as a way to form the virtues for a people who understand that their lives are shaped by God's good grace. The study of Aristotle was joined by the work of Aquinas, and in particular, his account of the virtues. Aquinas, of course, had followed Aristotle in developing an account of the virtues. But unlike Aristotle, he had singled out the four cardinal virtues, which he identified as prudence, temperance, courage, and justice. Aquinas was also different than Aristotle in that he had the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. Charity was the form of the virtues, which meant that our relationship with God entailed our own lives shaped by habits that made our devotion to God possible. My own work in the ethic of the virtues climaxed in my book, written with Charlie Pinchas, entitled Christians Among the Virtues. In the book, we provided a theological commentary on Aristotle's ethics. In particular, we argued that central to Aristotle's work is the importance of friendship as the relationship necessary for the development of the virtues. We did so keeping in mind that for Aquinas, charity is made possible by God's love, claiming us to be friends. I have recently developed this theme in a book called The Character Virtues, Letters to a Godson. In the book, I try to show how the virtues beg to be developed by the habits that shape our bodies through our everyday relationship with one another. How the virtues and peace are interrelated is a complex topic, but peace is not only made possible by the virtues, peace is a virtue. For peace depends not on our being trapped by the necessities that too often seem to make violence the only alternative. Rather, the alternative is people of virtue who refuse to make a choice of violence. So understood, peace is not a given. Rather, peace is a people whose lives make alternatives necessary that otherwise would not exist. Peace is a result of unlikely friendships. Peace is the kind of hospitality that this forum represents, even letting someone like me make a contribution to a topic that is of utmost importance. I am honored to have been part of the forum. Thank you very much.
شكرا
Thank you.
للبروفيسور ستانلي.
Thank you, Professor Stanley from Duke University in the USA. Thank you for these thoughtful remarks about the origins of ethical philosophy and its values throughout religions and different human philosophies, and how we may arm ourselves with the knowledge gained from human philosophy, derived from human philosophy and wisdom.
and how we could use this philosophy to build human connections and seek peace. We feel honored to have you, sir, here, given your experience and specialization. Now, I would like to move on to the next speaker, and I am sorry to have to change the order. And now I'm going to give the speech to Priest Adam Russell Taylor, who is the Executive Director of Sojourners and Leeds. He's also the author of a number of faith-focused books. He has occupied a number of important positions, including in the White House and the American Baptist Church. I'd like to invite you, Sir Adam Russell Taylor. The floor is yours, sir.
It is a true honor and privilege to be with you. Certainly wish that we could be together in person rather than virtually, but it is still a gift to be able to be together virtually. I'd like to extend my greetings and heartfelt thanks to His Eminence, Sheikh bin Baya, for his vision and leadership in promoting peace around the world, as well as religious tolerance. 2020 has been a very trying and traumatic year for our world. And in the midst of those challenges, I have often tried to find silver linings. One of which is remembering that 20 years ago, I gave my first sermon as I was called into ministry in the American Baptist and Progressive National Baptist Church. And while I am not here today to give a sermon, I do want to tag a title to my remarks, which is Healing the Body. Healing the Body. It is actually the title of my sermon 20 years ago when I preached from the book of 1 Corinthians, which is the Apostle Paul's letter to the church at Corinth, where he provides what I believe is one of the most powerful metaphors in all of Scripture. He compares the health and well-being of the church to that of the human body. And he goes on to explain that when one part of the body suffers, then all parts of the body suffer with it. When one part of the body is honored, then all parts are honored with it. He goes on to argue that we have to show a particular concern to the weakest parts of the body. They are the parts that are most indispensable. And he argues that we must show equal concern for one another. Apostle Paul was speaking to a church at Corinth that was riddled with division and acrimony, bickering over different views of doctrine and following different leaders. And yet he provides an antidote to that division when he provides this metaphor as how we function in society mirrors the very functioning of the body. And I believe that Paul's words provide a moral compass for how we as a world not only get through this long and dark night of the COVID pandemic, but how we can come through it and out of it in a way that co-creates a radically more just, compassionate, and loving world. If we were to conduct an MRI of our world's health in the midst of COVID, the results would be quite alarming and dire. The United States set two disturbing records this past Wednesday with 200,000 new COVID infections and 100,000 patients hospitalized in just one single day. Worldwide, 1.5 million people have lost their lives to COVID, with over 67 million cases reported in 217 countries. As I wrote in our online platform at sojo.net last week, we are running out of adjectives to describe this crisis. Staggering, sobering, harrowing, and heart-wrenching are just a few that come to mind as we enter into a deep, dark winter of suffering, loss, and hardship. And as we await the arrival of two highly anticipated vaccines this spring that provide a great deal of hope to conquer this darkness, we must remember that particularly we as the faith community possess many of the, what in my tradition and the Jewish tradition we call smooth stones that I believe we can use to mitigate and to arrest this pandemic. We also have the stones that will enable us to see through the pandemic in a way that co-creates a radically more just world. This is all tied into what I believe is necessary in order to spur this action, which is a revolution of virtue, a revolution of values. The World Bank reports that COVID-19 has already dealt an unprecedented setback to the worldwide effort to fight extreme poverty. The bank, who I used to work for, suggests that by 2021, an additional 110 to 150 million people who have fallen into the quicksands of extreme poverty because of COVID. Also reports that we'll see an increase of up to 45% in child mortality rates because of health service shortfalls and reductions in access to food. The fragile state of human rights and democracy has also been exacerbated by this pandemic. The Freedom House reports that governments have responded by engaging in abuses of power, silencing their critics and weakening or shuttering important institutions, often undermining the very systems of accountability that are needed to protect public health. The crisis of democratic governance, having begun long before the pandemic, is likely to continue after the health crisis recedes, as the laws and norms being put in place now will be difficult to reverse. These and so many other alarming trends lead to my second point, one that Archbishop Justin Welby made briefly in his remarks, that the COVID crisis is apocalyptic in its nature. The original meaning of apocalypse in ancient Greek is to uncover, to lay bare. We know that COVID-19 has laid bare so much of the brokenness of the human condition. It's laid bare divisions and failures in our politics, and even the erosion of core virtues that are rooted in our faith traditions of compassion, of solidarity, and of cooperation. And while COVID-19 itself does not discriminate, unequal and unjust structures that are deeply rooted in our societies, including of systemic racism in the United States and in other parts of the world, does cause COVID to discriminate. In the US, COVID has disproportionately infected and killed people who are already in vulnerable situations. Those with pre-existing health conditions, those who are incarcerated, those who lack health insurance, those living in poverty, and in particular, Native Americans, African Americans, and Latinx Americans. A crisis like COVID has the potential to bring out our better angels or our worst demons. A crisis like COVID can unite us around a common threat, or it can further divide us, fueling isolationism, nativism, and xenophobia. I believe that the COVID crisis has been exacerbated and fueled by another virus, the virus of what I call the politics of division and a culture of hyper selfishness. The politics of division is fueled by fear, hatred, and hypocrisy. It is rooted in demonizing and scapegoating the other, and an us versus them mentality. It is often supercharged by attacks on truth and attacks on science in many countries. The politics of division has enabled the virus, the COVID virus, to thrive in the United States and in many other parts of the world. Selfishness and hyper-individualism has fueled the pandemic as it suffocates a concern for the welfare of others and can exalt liberty above the very common good. Selfishness has even been converted into a virtue, dating all the way back to Ayn Rand's best-selling 1964 book, The Virtue of Selfishness. I would argue that the starkest example of the power of a politics of division and a culture of selfishness is around the issue of wearing a mask, which public health experts have told us since the beginning of this pandemic is critical for not only protecting ourselves, but for protecting others from infection. In the US context, let me illustrate this a little bit further. Since mid-March, when President Trump declared the novel coronavirus a national emergency, the Brookings Institute has been tracking mask use and social distancing behaviors through a study called the National Panel Study of COVID-19. It found that 40% of Americans who do not wear a mask say they don't wear one because it is their right as an American to not wear a mask, followed by 24% who say that they don't wear one because it's uncomfortable. Somehow mask wearing has become a partisan and cultural issue in this country. In the spring, when the first wave of the virus escalated in the US, I became deeply concerned about how this cancer of selfish individualism and of the politics of division was helping to fuel the pandemic and make it much worse in this country. And yet that flies in the face of the very religious values of compassion, solidarity, and cooperation. I would argue in my faith tradition, it literally contradicts Matthew 25 and a commitment to the golden rule to love and care for our neighbors as ourselves. But it's too easy to blame politicians, whether it's President Trump or others, that have often been reckless and even dangerous in their rhetoric about mask wearing. We all must take responsibility, including religious leaders who I argue could be the game changer in changing behavior now, even before the world has access to a vaccine, in order to help change the course of this pandemic. A study by the Institute of Health and Metrics, an evaluation at the University of Washington, found that if nearly all Americans wore face masks when they leave their homes, we could collectively save 100,000 lives and perhaps more than 500,000 lives to the end of February. That means simply wearing a mask has become an issue of life, it has become an issue of morality and of religion. This message needs to be more boldly taught and taught across all of our faith traditions. I believe that we can learn from a concept that I studied and have benefited from for most of my adult life, called Ubuntu. It is a deep moral concept, philosophical concept that is common in Southern Africa, particularly South Africa. I learned about it when I studied abroad there in 1995. I also learned Zulu, and in the Zulu language, when you greet someone with a now popularized greeting, Sawubona, it literally means, I see you. And the response is Siyakona, which means I am here. The greeting reflects the African notion of Ubuntu, that I am because we are. It conveys that I cannot fully be made human until you see me as fully human, that I cannot fully care for myself until I fully care for you as well. It conveys just how inextricably interconnected our lives are as neighbors, as a country, and even as a globe. And I believe that Ubuntu combines the three virtues of compassion, solidarity, and cooperation to create a meta virtue that would be a clear antidote to the virus of the politics of division and a culture of selfishness. Our interdependence is not just an ontological reality. It is an ethic, a virtue that should shape our worldview, inspire our actions, and guide our priorities. Ubuntu provides a critical lens to understand the ways in which the globe has become much more interconnected. Increasingly, our security and our prosperity are tied to the rest of the world. And with global crises such as climate change and, of course, COVID-19, we can only solve them through shared global cooperation and leadership. Yes, Ubuntu represents a critical anecdote, and I believe that it is echoed in so many of our religious traditions. In my Christian tradition, I mentioned the words of the Apostle Paul, that when one part of the body suffers, then all parts suffer with it. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had his own remix of this text when he said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. In other words, infection with COVID anywhere in the world represents a threat of infection everywhere in the world. As Pope Francis reminded the world in his latest encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, on universal fraternity and social friendship, he says and argues that the world is deeply interconnected and we are all called by our faith to become and act as one human family. The concept of tikkun olam in Judaism, to repair the world and to mend the world, echoes the very virtues of Ubuntu. The moral law of karma in Buddhism, in which good actions generate positive consequences and bad actions, negative ones, also echoes Ubuntu. In Islam, the emphasis that all humans are equal regarding their dignity and equal worth echoes Ubuntu. What is needed in this moment is a revolution of values, a revolution of virtue. And I believe it's critical not just for how we respond now to the epidemic and the pandemic, but how we respond once the world has increasing access to a vaccine. We know that vaccines themselves do not save lives. Vaccinations save lives. And similar to the way in which Mask wearing has been overly politicized and held hostage by hyper-individualism and selfishness. There is a real danger that the rush and the race to vaccinate the world's population could also be sabotaged by the very same.
بقيت لكم دقيقة سيدي، دقيقة واحدة، أرجو أن تختموا.
I apologize, sir. You only have 1 minute left. If you may, please conclude your speech.
1 minute.
1 minute, that's perfect. Thank you. I believe that religious leaders could play a key role in helping to combat disinformation about the use of vaccines. We know that religious leaders have a significant degree of moral authority. They have a significant degree of trust that they enjoy with their congregations. And so this is a moment for religious leaders to provide a critical leadership role in helping to make vaccines acceptable. All of us could publicly get our vaccine when it is our turn and opportunity to do so. Help conquer some of the fear, distrust, and stigma surrounding the use of vaccines. Going back to my initial sermon 20 years ago, I was preaching in the context of the AIDS crisis, another pandemic that threatened the very health and livelihood of the world. And I said in that sermon that I don't think God only sees the words HIV, in other words, the human immunodeficiency virus. And in God's eyes, God saw an opportunity, an imperative to heal the international village through our response to the HIV and AIDS crisis. Well, I believe there is a similar opportunity in the context of the COVID pandemic, that if we truly embrace and then live out the virtues of compassion, cooperation, and tie those to this deeper understanding of Ubuntu, we could work together, not simply to mitigate and ultimately end the COVID crisis. We could work together to heal our international village of the very viruses of selfishness and division and racism that has so often fueled the COVID crisis itself. Let us work together to repair the world, to realize a radically more humane, loving, and just world as we come out of this dark night of COVID and into the promise of tomorrow. Thank you. God bless.
شكرا لفضيلة القس آدم راسل تايلور على هذا التحليل العميق للعلاقة ما بين.
Thank you very much for this deep analysis. And thank you for clarifying the manifestations of the current crisis as we could see it in terms of how responsible or irresponsible people were dealing with the crisis, how people were caring for others or not, the levels of compassion. And thank you for emphasizing the importance of the role of religious leaders in dealing with this pandemic and trying to mitigate its impact. I would like now to point to something where Islam and Christianity are on the same page, and that is when the body feels feverish, if only one part of the body is sick. And the same goes for the whole society or for the whole world, because there is a hadith by the Prophet that says that the whole body or the whole nation of Muslims, it is like the same body. So if one part of this body or if one organ of this body is sick, then all other organs in the same body would also feel sick. And thank you very much for your contribution. Now I would like to give the floor to Dr. Ibrahim Mashrouh if he is ready to take over. And if he is not, then I'll give the floor to Dr. Abdallah Said Wuld Abba, Professor of Philosophy, University of Nouakchott, and Forum for Promoting Peace trustee from Mauritania. he has written profusely about philosophy and the interpretation approaches, and he is very interested in the political affairs of the Arab world and also the relations between the Arab countries and the other parts of the world. So, Dr. Wild Abah, you have the floor.
سيد ولد البا تسمعونني؟
أنا سأتحدث.
Can you hear me?
نعم أسمعك الآن. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
مرحبا.
أنا سأتحدث حول قيمة.
I am going to talk about a value which I think did not get enough attention in philosophical or in contemporary philosophical studies, which is the value of mercy. All monotheistic religions care about mercy. And in this paper that I'm presenting, I looked at a very famous text by the German philosopher Hans Jonas, and it was titled God After Auschwitz. And in this paper, he posed an important question: how can we rethink evil in a context where the criteria of individualism, freedom, and responsibility refer to the theology of power? And isn't this going against some other characteristics of God, which is mercy and love? This is nothing new. So in all theologies, there were attempts to answer this question. And they were trying to bring together or to find a balance between the power of the divine power and the divine, the loving divine figure. However, what is new here is the following, that we are looking here at the power, charity, and the ability to seek knowledge. And Jonas sees that it is important to put together the characteristic of power or absolute power and to focus on the other two characteristics. And this thesis by Jonas is has a Jewish background. However, it also converges with some things that were said by Christian philosophers. So, for instance, Vattimo, he was talking about a weak religious belief, and he says that there are possibilities to find common grounds. And as I was saying, that this is nothing new in theological thinking, and all monotheistic religions tried to find a solution for that, the presence of evil and what is the solution from the part of faith in such a case. And in this relationship, or in the Christian thinking, there is a focus on love as a characteristic of God. But from an Islamic perspective, there is more focus on the idea of mercy. And I would like to say that the concept of love, which is something that was a bit controversial when it came to trying to explain what divine love is, we find that the Sufis, for instance, focused on mercy, and that it is an important characteristic of God, and it is one of the names of God. And the Sufis see that the main divine characteristic is mercy, because there are two of the most prominent names of God, which are Al-Rahman, Al-Rahim, the most merciful, the most compassionate. And they also connected this with justice, and that mercy may be misunderstood as a manifestation of weakness, for instance. However, that is not the case. The difficulty there was trying to understand divine mercy in combination with the power of God and the justice of God. And this was one of the difficult concepts to explain in Islamic theology. Then if we look to the interpretations of Quranic verses, and especially the verses that are talking about mercy, we find that having mercy or enjoying mercy is connected to following religion. And if we look at mercy or the definition of mercy, we will find that it is connected with many more concepts, and not just mercy in itself. It goes far beyond this particular concept.
أغلب المتكلمين من أهل السنة
Many Sunnis and Mu'tazila
صفة الرحمة
were keen to interpret
فإنهم ما واجهوه في الحقيقة
mercy and the qualities of the meanings,
الوجهة التأويلية
and this
للصفات الإلهية
led them to change
الوجودية
the
ربطوا هذه الصفات
interpretation of the
الصفات الإلهية بأبعادها الأخلاقية
characteristics of God,
انتبه إليه أعلام الصوفية
and
في حديثهم عن الرحمة
they described, for instance, mercy as being obligatory to God by virtue of
التي هي الوجه الآخر من عقيدة التوحيد
his power.
وهذا ما يفضي بنا إلى الحديث عن ضرورة
This leads us to talk about how we need to rethink the value of mercy.
بدأت في التقليد المسيحي رغم أن التقليد اللاهوتي المسيحي كان
And this virtue started in the Christian tradition, even though there was a bit of resistance at the beginning of looking at this characteristic, but the modern Christianity started looking at this, and I'm referring to messages by the late Pope Jean Paul II and the current Pope, who have clear messages there about mercy. In this context, I would like to rediscover mercy in Islamic philosophy. And I would like to say that mercy in Islam or in Arabic does not have the same connotations as in English. It is not restricted to showing mercy to somebody who is weaker or who deserves commiseration. In Arabic, the word mercy comes from the same root also as the mother's womb. And although the saying of mercy is based in its etymological structure on the meaning of closeness and kinship in the most accurate and strongest dimensions associated with the mother's womb. However, the definition adopted by linguists, commentators, and speakers and jurists have refrained from this connotation. And there is also a hadith that was narrated by Bukhari about Umar ibn al-Khattab, and it says that there was a woman who was enslaved, and she found a child who was motherless, so she breastfed this child, and this was something that the Prophet saw, and he said that, can you see how much mercy this woman showed to that motherless child? Well, God is more merciful than to his creatures or creations than this woman is with that child. So
وإن كانوا في الغالب لم يلقوا صعوبات كبرى في قبول معاني الغضب والرضا والانتقام والإنعام والعزة
there were also difficulties when it came to the explanation of the different aspects of mercy and reconciling this with other divine characteristics, including, for instance, the God's anger or God's wrath.
مستنكفين الطريقة الأقوم والأوضح التي بينها الحق تعالى لمعرفته وتعرف الخلق عليه، وهو صفة الرحمة التي تحدد آفاق النظرية. نجملها ثلاث ملاحظات أخيرة. الملاحظة الأولى
I have some comments. And one of the comments is that there is an existential primacy of mercy, in the sense that the path of creation and the cosmic management is based on benevolence and on charity and goodness. And you have one minute left. Okay, I need 5 minutes actually. There is a mistake that was committed by philosophers and speakers, and that is the delusion of the subjective nature of existence, which is self-sufficient, in what results in the determination of fixed and total controlling standards. And the system of this existence, even with the adoption of the doctrine of creation, is reduced to the moment of its original foundation. Also, the doctrine of creation, although it includes the necessity of believing in contravention and complete impartiality as the truth of monotheism, but at the same time it includes the meaning of closeness, selection, and friendship. And God described himself as being closer to his worshippers than a vein cord, and that God has made it or has obliged himself to show mercy to his creatures. And then there is the last comment, and that is, if the divine power cannot be understood in terms of external oppression and arbitrary hegemony according to human standards, then divine justice cannot be understood in the sense of exchange and barter. Otherwise, the fulfillment of the divine religion cannot be conceived from the outset, as long as God Almighty is the true source of all blessings and the true conciliator of obedience and gratitude. There are many texts that imply the principle of just retribution, and
وتتوعد المسيء بالعقوبة لا إلزاما وفرضا على الإرادة الإلهية المطلقة. هذا ما تنبأ إليه الغزالي بقوله
Imam al-Ghazali was alerted to this fact by saying that expand the mercy of God Almighty and do not weigh divine matters with official brief scales. So divine justice is only perceived from the perspective of mercy, which is the absolute benevolence preceding the system of existence and its comprehensive preservation, control, and end. And it is the truth of absolute divine generosity that appears in central concepts that contemporary philosophers have worked on, such as love, generosity, and forgiveness. And as the Prophet said, the merciful will receive mercy. Thank you very much for this.
قضية الرحمة عبر تقاليد ثلاث.
Thank you for this very insightful intervention and how Judaism, Christianity, and Islam share the same value and in content. And also thank you for briefly looking at the word mercy from a terminological point of view. Of course, this intervention comes from a highly distinguished speaker. And thank you for the book you mentioned. Thank you, Mr. Abdullah, for your for this intervention about Islamic thought. Now I ask Dr. Mustafa Stirij, the former Mufti of Bosnia and the head of the scholars in the. He has a lot of experience and knowledge in terms of crises and conflict resolution, as well as the suffering of the Muslims in Bosnia and Herzegovina. His conviction has not changed, and that is that the future of Muslims is in consolidating the values of international peace and cooperation. These are values that we are in need of nowadays. I invite you, Dr. Mustafa Stirij. The floor is yours, sir.
In the name of Allah, the Merciful, the Compassionate, thank you, Dr. Ahmed, and thank you. It's good to see you in good health. I greet you all from Sarajevo, and I greet especially our leader, Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayer, and I greet everybody who helped hold this forum and all who's attended. The subject, as I understand, is the corona pandemic and the need for tranquility, or the sakina, the Arabic word for tranquility, for quietude. And I would start by saying that that fear and tranquility are opposites. And the fear of corona pandemic is a psychological state more than being a physical state. And psychologists have warned against deep impacts of corona on psychological health and mental health today, because people are afraid of this invisible and strong enemy. And researchers have been telling us that the priority should be monitoring the levels of fear and anxiety and self-harm and suicide and other afflictions that befall our souls. We have heard from a person called Kate King. She's 57 years old, and she suffers depression, and she said that the times are difficult for people with psychological problems. She added that anxiety is a natural response to our present situation, and I suffer a mild level of anxiety at all times. And you could suddenly be hit by waves of concerns as you follow the news or think about your own health or the health of others. Late last March, the Academy of Medical Sciences in the United Kingdom conducted 2 online surveys that gave a glimpse of the current state of the population's mental health under these conditions of the corona pandemic. The first survey covered a sample of over 2,600 individuals, including many, or rather 2,100 persons, including many people who are suffering mental health. And the survey highlighted their fears about access to support and services during the pandemic, as well as their concern about the deterioration of their own health. This second survey covered a sample of 14,099 individuals, members of the public, and they identify their concerns over the effects of social isolation and economic difficulties resulting from this crisis. So, alongside the drugs and the breathing apparatuses required to treat certain corona cases, we also need to treat people's souls and hearts, mental health. And this is where the role of muftis comes in Muslim societies, because muftis are psychologists for these societies. And in order for muftis to be able to treat people's souls and hearts, they must be qualified to diagnose what's wrong with those souls and hearts. Because if you don't know the diagnosis, if you don't know what the sickness is, you will never find a treatment. And people's souls are afraid of this pandemic, and their hearts are fearful and anxious. Therefore, today, people are in dire need for the tranquility vaccine, i.e., to be secured against this pandemic. We today suffer a crisis in people's minds and hearts because we are concerned. We don't know, where did this affliction come from? And we stand before it incapable of protecting ourselves. We must recognize that there is an important new role for muftis, which is to dispel fears and to give tranquility to people. And God mentioned tranquility in 6 different places. Firstly, in the verse where it says, "And the prophet said to them, the proofs of this kingdom is that the ark shall come to you, bringing tranquility from your Lord, and relics left by the family of Moses and the family of Aaron, and it will be carried by angels. And that is a sign for you if you are believers." And this tranquility is actually an ark or a chest, a wooden chest, representing a form of a security blanket, which were told by Islamic scholars that it would contain venerated objects from the relics of prophets and their remnants. And God sent down tranquility also on his, caused his tranquility to descend upon his messenger and the believers. And he sent legions you didn't see. And here, tranquility is a stillness and calmness and compassion and gentleness and reassurance. And the term descended, caused the tranquility to descend upon his messenger and the believers means that he poured it into their soul, into their hearts. And the need for this tranquility is based on that we need to be aware that God is helping, God is sending his assistance, although we might not see it. Third verse, the Quran tells us, and he said to his companion, don't grieve, surely Allah is with us. And then Allah sent down his tranquility upon him and supported him with forces, which you didn't see. So the previous verse was referring to collective fear and collective tranquility, whilst this verse is referring to individual fear and tranquility. The corona pandemic is also caused by individual fear, and our need for tranquility against it is also individual. And this is why the Messenger of Allah said to his companion whilst they were hiding in the cave, do not grieve, surely Allah is with us. And this shows that, emphasizes that God is with them. And the Messenger of Allah sought to dispel from the heart of his companion Abu Bakr the signs of fear and feelings of sadness and give him a feeling of reassurance and confidence in victory. And in the case of the corona pandemic, we are all individuals needing a word of comfort, needing to be told, do not be grieved. Surely Allah is with you, and he will dispel your fears and emphasize a sense of tranquility. And this is why it's important to have a spiritual remedy and treatment for corona before, and focus on it more than the physical. God tests us in good times and bad times. The Prophet, peace be upon him, says, how wonderful is the situation of believers, for theirs is good in everything. And this applies only to the believers. If prosperity attends them, they express gratitude and Allah rewards them for that. And if they are hit by adversity, they endure it patiently, and Allah also rewards them for that. Secondly, we need to recognize that the mission of the Mufti and the Fatwa is to address the profound effects of corona pandemic on mental health at present and in the future. Due to the fear and anxiety towards this invisible and unknown enemy. And although corona is bad on one side, it has good sides, good aspects, including people's awareness and appreciation of the gift and blessing of their health, which was taken for granted in the past and will drive people to atone for their sins. For the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, never is a believer stricken with discomfort, hardship, or illness, grief, or even with mental worry, that his sins are not expiated for him. Third lesson, patience with corona in order to be rewarded with tranquility, because the more a person is afflicted, the more he will be rewarded. And so diseases vary and pains vary, and the more pain increases, the more the reward. And we mustn't consider that increased pain is a disaster. It is, in fact, an occasion for more rewards from God. Number 4. The corona pandemic is a call from Allah to all humanity to return to their Lord and reminding them of their disobedience and wake them from their slumber. Humans, as we now see, when disease hits them, such as with this corona pandemic, and when it strikes them and deepens its severity, as today we see, they say, why? Why is this? Why did it afflict me? Why? What's the cause? Where did it come from? And who amongst us caused this abominable disease? Now, God told us in the Quran, say it is but from yourselves. So mankind is told that it is by his own sins. God Almighty also said in the Quran, and no evil befalls you except it be from your own self. So humans must reconsider their actions in terms of their protecting the environment against pollution, as well in terms of protecting the human soul from corruption. This is more dangerous. It is much more dangerous pollution and corruption because the environmental pollution stems from the pollution of the human soul. Because people are in slumber when they are in good health. And now that Corona has struck them, they start to wonder, why? What caused this? What have I done for Corona to strike me? And then they start to think and analyze and review and come to answer. It was due to my sins. But what are those sins? When did I commit them? How many are they? And then people start to bring themselves to account and become aware of the cause of this affliction, that it befell them because of themselves, and they return to their Lord in repentance and submit to their Lord, seeking and hoping for forgiveness, pledging to repent, and that if they recover from this illness, they shall not return to this disobedience. Many people have changed their path in life because of illness. And if it were not for the illness, they would not have changed, but in fact, the opposite, they would have grown in arrogance and distance from the true path. So undoubtedly, the pandemic of Corona has changed many concepts about people's roles and destiny in life. The entire world will not return to where it was before. Allah Almighty says in the Quran, Allah does not change the condition of a people until they change what is in themselves. Thank you very much for this. Thank you very much, Your Excellency Sheikh Mustafa Sirij, for this wonderful exposition about the issue of tranquility, and you based yourselves on survey, and you focused on the sources of tranquility from the religious texts, from the Quran and the Sunnah, and he also shown the need for religious leaders to give comfort to their societies and communities, and to learn the lessons of Corona, where people go back to re-examine their sins and go back to their Lord. Thank you then very much. I will now give the microphone to the next speaker, Bishop Hossam Naum, the Anglican Bishop of Jerusalem, and the representative of the Anglican Diocese of Jerusalem. And he's also active in religious relations and interreligion dialogue. We listen to him if he's ready.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and peace be upon you all.
I greet each and every one of you in the name of our God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. And I also bring you greetings from Jerusalem, from the holy city of Jerusalem, Al-Quds al-Sharif. And thank you for the opportunity to be together at this very important event in the life of our world today and in the life of our communities, both here and globally. And to all those involved in this very important forum for promoting peace in Muslim societies, in which Jerusalem is one of those. And also a big thank you also for His Eminence, the Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, for his initiatives for promoting such important values in the life of our world today. You know, the overarching theme set before us for this year's meeting is an essential one, and the human values in time of crisis. And this session focuses on COVID-19 and the need for inner tranquility. Tranquility in times of peace and luxury is one thing, and in times of war, natural disasters, or epidemic or pandemic is another. Tranquility is a state of well-being and inner peace and quietness, is not to be taken for granted, especially at this very critical time, very exceptional time of COVID-19 pandemic. Inner tranquility is a state of being that embedded in a moral and an ethical system, whether religious, humane, or secular. And also it is an important process in which we also try to get into the inner restoration and healing, as Reverend Adam has pointed to. I am really moved at the metaphor of the ship's passengers used at this conference to reflect on the importance of our common humanity in facing this pandemic. This rich image brings the themes of togetherness and common destiny at the forefront of our earthly agenda at this time, a term we call in our Christian tradition the common good, or in Arabic it's also translated al-khayr al-aam. Tranquility and serenity are reflections to our moral and ethical beliefs. For us Christians, virtues are important tools which help both individuals and communities to live a godly life, moral and virtuous living. Christian virtues can be divided into two groups, as Professor Haworth have pointed to: the cardinal virtues, which of prudence, fortitude, temperance, and justice, and also the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. And for us, as Christians, looking at these, especially the theological virtues, just to give an example of how these virtues, help individuals and communities in order to process so many things that come into their way of life, and especially in facing, their inner fears. Faith in God is important, and it is actually the bedrock of our own living, and how we can really face these challenges in our lives in so many ways. So faith is very, very important, and it is actually in the place from which we begin to reflect on things that happen within our lives. And similarly, hope is really important, because hope gives us not only the strength, but also it gives us the sustenance in which we wait and anticipate in hope for what is to come. And whatever situation we go through, we know that our humanity will overcome with the help of God. So for example, vaccine is one sort of hope that our world is waiting as we await the distribution of such important. And just pointing to the other virtues, and a fair distribution of such vaccines would be also important. So therefore, we have these virtues in order to guide our lives in so many ways, because a virtue is a positive habit and a way of life. And also the opposite of virtue, as we all know, is vice. And these two words rhyme in Arabic, because we speak about, on the one hand, the virtue is fadila, and the vice is radila. So fadila and radila are two opposites. The need to revive virtue in our community is very, very important, because as many of my brothers have pointed to, it is an important tool in which it can help us not only to restore and heal our communities, but also it can help us to overcome so many fears. So for example, virtues lead to right decisions, and therefore happiness and tranquility, externally and internally. This is an important source and resource of virtuous life, what some people called, positive energy. And like to have a positive energy within oneself, we have to draw into something, something that really we can draw from in order to have such positive attitudes within ourselves and for the environment around us. COVID-19 pandemic resulted in a significant damage of social life, both individual and communal, including poverty, violence, despair, and anxiety. And we know that anxiety is one of the most cruel things that people can experience. And we all know that anxiety can be contagious. And also similarly, we know that positive energy, have positive attitudes towards life is also contagious. So the more we are living a life of tranquility and the inner peace, the more we can influence the community around us. As passengers who are in the same ship, we are in need for a common morality in facing the COVID-19 pandemic. And here in Jerusalem, we live this not only theoretically, but also practically by joining hands together and maybe just wearing the mask and encouraging people and social distancing, also broadcasting prayers through social media and so on and so forth is an important thing that we all together join hands. 3 Abrahamic religions are all together in facing. So common morality in facing the pandemic is really critical and essential. This is what we call togetherness. This is what we call the common good. Our common destiny calls us to one main thing in the light of the pandemic and many other threats that risks the existence, our existence and our well-being, and that is the sanctity of life. Preserving life is the true north of the compass of our common ship. So therefore, we have to know where our common and our true north lies as we sail together through this pandemic that we all face as a world community. This call for emergency reminds us of the important values that lead to inner tranquility within us. For example, we need to talk about more cooperation and solidarity, compassion and empathy, create an environment of peace in our lives. I would like just kind of to share a few, but I would like to share with you a few pragmatic things and practices which enhances our inner well-being and tranquility. So prayer, for example, is an important, not only practice, is an important life, because we, people of faith, we are grounded in life of prayer as we get closer to God, closer to ourselves, and closer to our neighbors. So family bonds as well, and friends is also an important thing. And we spoke about, how community is important. We in the Middle East, in the East, we value family bonds and family relations because it's a safeguard for the human soul and the well-being of individuals. And community and individuals are really and deeply are connected together. And also caring for oneself and doing things also that we like music and sports and arts. And these are kind of pragmatic things that we can do, as well as spiritual practices, because talking about inner tranquility has to do with, maybe in secular we speak about psychology, but we speak also about our spiritual well-beings as people of God and as people of faith. And also as churches, we practice also pastoral care for our community. And I think, we as mosques or as synagogues and churches, we are entrusted with our communities to care for them and to care for their souls and for their well-beings. And also, I would like to share with you another practical aspect within our diocese, and I'm sure that many other churches and other religious institutions, that we have over 30 institutions within our diocese that between healthcare and education and rehabilitation, including a hospital in Gaza and a hospital in Nablus in the West Bank. And these hospitals serve many, many people. And at this time, people are facing this pandemic together. And we know our responsibility towards our communities in which we live in. And finally, I would like to end with a scriptural verse from the letter to the Philippians, chapter 4, which reads, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made to God. And in Arabic it reads, لا تهتموا بشيء بل في كل شيء بالصلاة والدعاء مع الشكر لتعلم طلباتكم لدى الله. كل الشكر. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
شكرا جزيلا فضيلة مطران حسام نعوم على
شكرا جزيلا. Thank you very much for this great intervention about the need for tranquility and inner peace, and also talking about the values that are based on virtues and how we can deal with crises. And all this, of course, requires us to have inner peace and to have a clear spirit. And perhaps as people who are involved with faith and with religions, we think that it's more important to take into consideration this aspect as well as the intellectual one. Thank you very much for your speech, and at least we had a glimpse of the holy city of Jerusalem. And now I give the floor to Dr. Radwan Al-Sayed, Professor Emeritus of Islamic Studies in Lebanon University and a member of the Forum for Promoting Peace, and he's a trustee. Of course, he doesn't need to be introduced. He's very well known to everybody, and maybe a lot of people see him via the internet. Dr. Radwan has a very long history in his field and with Islam, and also very well acquainted with the Western disciplines that deal with Islam. He has contributed a lot in the Arab world in terms of sharing in reform projects. Dr. Radwan Al-Sayed has the ability to talk very precisely, and we are hoping that he will be able to do so. It seems that your microphone is turned off. Is it on now? Please take the floor.
محاضرتي أو مطالعتي حلف الفضول الجديد والقيم الإنسانية المشتركة. Is the new alliance of virtue and common human values. And with regards to values, there are two issues. There are وهناك الحق في the principle of the value and the right to enjoy that value or participate in it. في العصر الحديث amongst philosophers and in modern times Kant, for example, tells us that the values are a priori and everything in this regard is known a priori, and يقينا تاما وإلا لما كان هناك a principle of value then requires that it is known fully, فالأمر على النحو نفسه في مبادئ الأخلاق. And the same principle as applies to mathematics applies to ethics, and ethical values are holistic, universal and obligatory, and they are not subjected to varying experience from time to time and place to place. And therefore, in more modern times, of course, we have had many arguments over this issue, the ethics of obligation, which were founded by Kant. However, the problematics and the debates have been reduced or lesser now, and they're not a concern of religions, in fact, because Abrahamic traditions talk about the right and the value. But the deeper and the more ancient problematic is the connection between the right and a value. So who has the right to participate in such values by enjoying the dignity which is required by his own humanity? And the issue, this problematic of the right of enjoying a value still exists today. There are problems of discrimination, of reduced dignity, which reduces the ability to enjoy such a right. All this is still present in our day. And Sheikh bin Bayat talks about the introduction to the new Alliance of Virtue, about the values which all humans enjoy. And there has been this declaration of the religious rights by the Catholic Church in 1965, which gives the religious rights to all humans based on human dignity. And I will now tell you briefly about two projects on common human values in Western thought, contemporary projects. And then, and very briefly again, I will speak about an analysis and a deduction
حلف الفضول الجديد. المشروع الأول في مطلع التسعينات للاهوت الكاثوليكي
The first project was from the Catholic theologian Hans Funk, who said in his book,
الاستمرارية من دون أخلاق كونية، يعني وهذه هي اللمحة الكونية هنا. لا سلام عالمي من دون سلام ديني ولا سلام ديني من دون الحوار بين الأديان. السلام الديني يريد من ورائه أن تتلاقى الأديان الكبرى جميعا على قواسم مشتركة في مجال القيم وأصول الأخلاق وعلى مستوى العالم. يقدم بكلام طويل جدا ثم ينتهي إلى ثلاثة أمور: الإدراك أن الأخلاق مطلب مشترك وتفيد منه الدول حيث ما عادت القوانين كافية ولا السلطة الإكراهية لإنفاذ القانون مشكلة. والأمر الثاني الحاجة للمقاربة القيمية والأخلاقية للمشكلات المتزاحمة تفرض تعاونا بين المؤمنين وغير المؤمنين. فبحسب يستطيع البعض من غير المتدينين عيش سيرة مستقيمة وإنسانية بدون التدين بدين، لكن معظم البشر يجدون في الدين والتدين مستندا أخلاقيا كبيرا. وما دام الطرفان يعترفان بالحاجة الملحة إلى مقاربة قيمية وأخلاقية لمشكلات العالم فلا غنى عن التعاون. المقاربة القيمية والأخلاقية للمشكلات العالم في نظرتي هي تبدأ بتحقيق السلام بين الأديان من طريق إعادة اكتشاف القيم المشتركة بين الديانات، وألف 6 كتب في 6 ديانات بحثا عن القيم المشتركة وليس في الديانات الإبراهيمية فقط. الديانات الإبراهيمية الثلاث والبوذية والهندوسية وديانات أصغر أيضا، ومنها بعض ما يسمى بالديانات الطبيعية. وعلى هذا الأساس اشتغل على لاهوت عالمي من المقاربة وحظي بنجاحات كبرى في التسعينات.
This approach met a great deal of success in the 1990s. He was Catholic, he is independent from the Vatican. And during the papacy of John Paul, he coincided in his efforts with the Vatican and their conference. The second project, and the more recent,
يبدأ من
starts with
مكان مختلف
from a different place. However, it
إلى نفس الأمر. هو مشروع
leads to the
الفيلسوف
same
الكندي
results.
المشهور
And
تشارلز تايلور.
it's a project of Charles Taylor, Canadian philosopher. In his second book, his most important book,
هو يبدأ من مكان مختلف.
of 2007,
هو يبدأ من هذه العلمانيات المتتالية
the age of secularism. He starts somewhere else. He starts from the various secularism
في العالم.
which undermines coexistence around the world. So the system of human coexistence in our living together. And he states that prior to those multiple secularism, postmodern and pre-modern societies had more solidarity and agreed on ethical foundations within them and in their relations to other communities and societies. Wars, however, didn't disappear altogether, but the values of solidarity and of cooperation and ethical values in general were clearer and were more stable and were more rooted were part of people's lives. And he claims that there is another opportunity to return
لاستنهاض هذه القيم من خلال تصدعات الحداثة وما بعدها ومن خلال ظواهر عودة الدين ويذهب إلى أن هذا الأمر بدأ أول ما بدأ كم هو قلق كم هم العلمانيون أيضا مفكرين وسياسيين جديين كم هم قلقون لهذا التزعزع والتصدع الأخلاقي حتى مع حكم القانون في الديمقراطية. يبدأ بمناقشة نظرية العدالة جون روز 1971 ثم يمضي إلى الثمانينات. ذكر بعض المحاضرين هذه الفلاسفة الذين اشتد قلقهم وذكر منهم درس منهم 7 بدءا برولز ووصولا إلى الذين ناقشوا نظرية رولز وأدى إلى وأن كل هذه التصدعات أدت إلى استعادة استكشاف القيم التي أصلها
caused the rediscovery of the values that were part of the United Nations Charter and the International Declaration of Human Rights, that they were of religious origin. And when the religion aspect of them, or that the religious spirit was removed from them, they have become weaker. And now we are seeing a return of religion because people have discovered that without these religious ethics and the elements of cohesion and in societies, we cannot continue to live together as human beings, and our problems and our fissures will deepen.
بين عشرات المشروعات الأخرى.
Taylor's project is amongst dozens of other projects, and I wanted to mention these two projects because they have in common the fact that they are concerned with the ethical question alongside the alliance of virtue. Also,
يتحدث عن البواعث
also in the Marrakesh Declaration.
القلق
His Excellency Sheikh bin Bayat talks about the existential angst and
التنميط والتشييع والعقلانية النمطية التطور التكنولوجي وانفصال الاقتصاد عن الإطار الأخلاقي وظهور الإنسان الاقتصادي ويتشارك في هذه البواعث في كثير من الأمور مع
these are causes that he identifies in common with much of what Taylor and before him what Hans King said and other German philosophers. All the time you have been speaking yourselves about the German philosopher
صاحب نظرية الإله الضعيف اسمه يونس مش جونس لا ينطقون الجي.
He's called Jonas, not Jonas, as we heard from some of our colleagues. Jonas.
رأيته مرة في جامعة تübingen عندما كنت أدرس في ألمانيا. أتى وحاضر عند هانس
University, and he came. He was there, and Hans King was also there. Also, and I was very young, and I didn't understand their ideas. And Mr. Wildebert had in fact drawn my attention. Now, there are 7 motivations, as Sheikh Abdul talks about, as reasons for the initiative. 5 of them are common between him and all and many other thinkers and religion theologians in the Abrahamic traditions and others. However, these factors include the 7. Include 2, number 6 and 7, are related to us specifically as Muslims. We are seeing increasing cases of religious discrimination and attacks on places of worship and those worshipping. Secondly, there is an accusation that Islam is a violent religion responsible for terrorism and for extremism and extreme forms of religion which are threatening the mainstream, which is practicing it, whatever it's practicing in freedom. These 7 factors, motivations, إلى المبادئ هذا الميثاق to talk about the principles of this alliance, this charter, which and he identified 9. Firstly, there is the dignity and the freedom of religion and choice and compassion and mercy. And if we look at all those 9, we would see that they are really seeking to find the common ground, because they are common with the International Declaration for Human Rights, Universal Declaration for Human Rights. You have 2 minutes. So even when he mentions mercy, and he knows that there is a discrepancy, even if a little bit, with the international Universal Charter for Human Rights. I would now start to conclude. He mentioned 9 statements, declarations, and those statements and declarations are in fact produced by contemporary Islamic thinking, from 2004 in Amman document to the New Alliance of Virtue. They are all a product of contemporary Islamic thoughts. And what's new about them, this new trend, this new ethical reformist direction, and to change our ideas of the world and our vision of the world amongst the Muslims, and to change the image of Islam in the eyes of others. These 9 declarations, وبالذات and especially the 2 for which Sheikh bin Baya was responsible for, القديم يقول الحب ديني وإيماني وهو أيضا عند شيخنا الأكبر يقول في إعلان مراكش وفي in the Marrakesh Declaration and in the Alliance of Virtue that we have ليست عندنا فيها مشكلات we don't have problematics with the other Abrahamic religions. In fact, the opposite. We are reviving and basing on the religious of the Abrahamic religions, and we are seeking to bring them forward and work on them and to draw the world's attention to them at a time where we need an ethical approach. We have, however, 2 problems. Us Muslims, we have 2 problems. And I will speak simply about the issue, these 2 problematics. We have a problem with ethics because up till today we have not yet arrived at what can be considered a conceptual consensus over what is this revival that is being led by religious scholars and religious leaders in the Muslim world, with a new conscience of understanding what is necessary and not to be afraid of engaging with the rest of the world, because the rest of the world is not scary. So we still have disagreement, value disagreement. The second problematic is
هذه
the
الإعلانات
deduction,
كلها
the
والتي تطورت
theological
من
practice of
البيان
deduction. Now,
إلى
all these statements
إلى الإعلان إلى الميثاق عند العلامة بن باي.
the statement of Amman to the Marrakech
تراكما
Declaration to the Alliance.
في رؤية العالم تراكما باتجاه تغيير رؤية العالم في أوساط المسلمين.
View of the world.
ما يزال المسلمون كثير منهم ليس المتطرفين فقط عندهم مشكلة في الربط بين الحق والقيمة، يظنون أنفسهم مظلومين وبالتالي لا يستطيعون المشاركة في هذه القيم، لا يعطون الحق الكامل في المشاركة في هذه القيم العالمية الكبرى. وعندنا من جهة أخرى مسألة الموروث لم يستلمه التقليديون فقط، لا بالعكس الآن جزء كبير منه استخدمه الأصوليون والمتشددون والمتطرفون، وعلينا أن نحل هذه المشكلة في هذه القصة.
So we have a problem there.
الذي أختم به.
Now, I would like to conclude with
في الوقت الذي تشتد فيه الحاجة إلى روح ركاب السفينة في التضامن
where we need the spirit of the passengers of the ship in solidarity and in responsibility. This is the call of Sheikh bin Bay.
وعرض على الديانات الإبراهيمية وعلى العالم
we need to present it
على
to
إنفاذ
the
مشتركات الحق والخير
and
والسلام والتضامن والأخوة
what is common in solidarity and fraternity and responsibility, and our solidarity together gives us a part, gives us the agency to impact the world and to have an impact on peace in the world.
تشتد فيه الحاجة روح ركاب السفينة في التضامن والمسؤولية تنبعث عندنا بالإضافة إلى هذه القيم والفضائل الموجودة في الإسلام
stemming from our values of Islam.
There
is a new dimension today, new meaning, which is the sense and the spirit of accountability and enjoying what is good on others in Islam.
ورسالتهم إلى العالم الاحتساب الذي لا يبتغي المقابل إلا في الأخوة والحب والشوق والتوق للنظر إلى وجه الله سبحانه وتعالى. المسلم كما اكتشف ويكتشف وينهض وتقوى فيه هذه القيم ودوافع هذه القيم ويلتقي فيها مع أتباع الديانات الإبراهيمية ومع كل من يوافق عليها خارجها
يحتاج
بحسب العلامة البيئة إلى هذه الروح. هذا الروح وهذه الروح العلامة يستخدمها بالمؤنث والمذكر يحتاج إلى روح الاحتساب التي بالفعل لا يقصد في من ورائها مقابلا ولكنه يقصد فيها المعروف والخير العام. وشكرا لكم واختصرت كثيرا.
And I have been very brief. I've actually summarized quite a great deal. Thank you, Dr. Redwan. And Dr. Redwan has always what he says is always interesting and very deep. And he gave us an idea of common projects in the West for common ethics, and he expounded some of the differences between them and their objectives, and also compared them to the project of His Excellency Sheikh Allama bin Bayyah. And also talking about the context that we are addressing in the Islamic Ummah and how we need to deal with all of these. So thank you a great deal once again, Dr. Redwan Al-Sayed. And now our next speaker is Rabbi Professor Rovin Firestone, Regenstein Professor in Medieval Judaism and Islam at the Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles, and also the founder of the Center of Jewish Islamic Cooperation in Los Angeles, and has written a great many books and treatises on the relations between the Abrahamic religion, especially Judaism and Islam. I give you the speech, sir. Rabbi Rovin, please go ahead.
Thank you. Shalom Aleichem to everyone, and a warm thank you to all the honorable presenters here. May God bless the organizers and sponsors, and may God bless you all as well. It's an honor to have been invited to address this esteemed forum on the New Alliance of Virtue. That name, the New Alliance of Virtue, comes from an ancient event most of us know about that is known by almost the same name, the Alliance of Virtues. Here's what happened. I'll just review quickly. When Prophet Muhammad was a boy, he witnessed a terrible conflict in his native town of Mecca. This conflict became known as the Harb al-Fijar, the sacrilegious war. Those days, before the rise of Islam, was a time of absolute devotion to tribe. This loyalty made a mockery of justice and dignity toward anyone outside one's own tribe. The problem became so bad that people felt they could cheat anyone who belonged to a different clan. They felt free even to commit violence against them. There was no sense of universal brotherhood and friendship in Mecca during that time. It was so dangerous that people couldn't even trade with people of other tribes. It was every family alone and always in conflict with other families and even at war with them. It got so out of hand and such terrible things were happening that the people had no choice. Either they had to find a solution to the problem, or they would allow their society and the world they knew to collapse. After many negotiations, the tribes finally succeeded in creating a multi-tribal federation. The purpose was to transcend the narrow-mindedness and join people together so that all would benefit from kindness and compassion rather than suffer from cheating and victimhood. The community managed to form something much larger than narrow tribal loyalty. It was a federation of tribes based on shared values. These were shared values that everyone could understand and everyone could appreciate. It was called the Hilf al-Fudul, the Alliance of Virtues. No matter which tribe one belonged to or which god one worshiped, all were able to come together because they all aspired to the same values of mutual respect. This must have required a lot of negotiation and argument because it was an agreement made by human beings, and people can be very selfish. Later, when the Quran was revealed to Prophet Muhammad, those values were articulated through the transcendent voice of God. God emphasized in Surah Al-Ahzab that ultimate loyalty was not to be given to tribe, it was to be given to God. The famous statement, Tawakkal ala Allah wa kafa billahi wakilan. Put your trust in God, for God is sufficient as one to trust. If everyone is loyal to a higher power, we are less likely to allow family politics to divide us. And in the next verse, God says, Ma ja'alallahu lirajul min qalbayn fi jawfi. God has not put two hearts inside any person. And soon after that, God says that it's not important which father or tribe one belongs to. Fa ikhwanukum fi din, because all are brothers in religion. Now, we find the same message in the Bible. In the book of the prophet Malachi, it says in chapter 2, verse 10, Halo av echad lechulanu, halo el echad bara'anu, madua nivgad ish be'ahiv lachalel brit avotenu. Have we not all one Father? Did not one God create us? Why do we break faith with one another, defaming the covenant of our ancestors? Clearly, the ancient Jews had the same problem as the ancient Arabs. The Torah includes many stories of the same kinds of petty values between families and tribes. When there is division between communities and peoples, so much valuable energy and resources are wasted on fighting with one another. This problem of wasting resources by fighting between communities and peoples is universal. We see it everywhere today as in ancient times. Now, many of our ancestors believed that accepting the one true God would resolve these petty fights. Under one God, all our divisions would fall to the side as we came to realize our unity under God. True belief would bring everyone together when we realized the truth. But that did not happen. Why not? The reason simply is because we could not agree. Now, according to Jewish tradition, humans cannot agree because God created humans to be sentient beings with resolve, with egos, and with a need for independence. And that includes independent thinking. The Talmud teaches a story comparing the power of the mightiest human on earth with the power of God. The mightiest human was the Roman Caesar, the emperor. He would command the creation of millions and millions of denarius coins from the same mold, all bearing his own face. They were all exactly alike. But God was much more powerful. God, the Blessed Holy One, created many more millions of humans from the one mold of Adam, and yet every one of them is absolutely unique. We are all unique. We reflect, we deliberate, and because we are each unique, we differ. We will never agree about religion, even if we find agreement about God's unity. This applies not only between religions, but also within religions. There will always be division, different opinions, different assessments, different suggested solutions. And when there is disagreement, there is often bitterness and acrimony, and there is resentment. History has proven that even common belief in the one God will not resolve our petty fighting. That's because there will never be a shared understanding of God and God's demands. And what I have just said so far is only about monotheistic religious communities. There are billions of people in this world who are not monotheists. Disagreements are no less obvious among them. We will never have views and beliefs that we can all share. But despite our many differences of opinion and analysis, we all share the same basic values. We all crave love, whether Jew, Muslim, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, atheist, Black or white or brown. We all need to feel a sense of personal dignity. Everyone wants to be treated fairly and with respect. We all have the same requirements of clean water and healthy food, acceptable shelter in order to live. This is the beauty of the notion of an alliance of virtues, because it's not about belief. It's not about any particular religion. It's not about any particular political system. It's about values. And all humans share the same basic values that I just mentioned: love, dignity, fairness, respect, the right to live healthy lives. The success of the original Hilf al-Fudul, the Alliance of Virtues, lies in the fact that people could not realize their basic goals of feeling love when they were being attacked and killed. They could not attain a sense of personal dignity when they were insulted and cheated by others. It was great adversity in Mecca that brought the people to realize that they could not live lives of value when the others in their community could not live lives of value as well. It was only when they realized this that they were ready to form the pact. The original Alliance of Virtues brought together a very small collection of tribes because the difficulties they faced were insurmountable otherwise. Today, we are witnessing a global crisis, unknown in living memory. The global pandemic has illuminated the suffering that so many experience today from the very same indignities I just mentioned. People are suffering from terrible fear that they and their families will be the next victims. People cannot love when they are so terrified. They cannot have a sense of personal dignity when they feel that they are denied access. They cannot live if they are unable to earn reasonable wages for their work. This global pandemic is a horrific calamity that no one can ignore. That makes it also a real opportunity, exactly because something of this magnitude cannot be easily dismissed. Resolving the problem in one country, in one population, resolves nothing. The living virus will only return. No single community can become healthy until the entire world becomes healthy. This is a lesson that we have no choice but to learn. God created us to think differently from one another, but while we differ over opinions and beliefs, we share these same core values. We can feel the fear of others. We can taste their need for dignity as we feel it ourselves. It seems to me that only through a global alliance of virtues will we be able to save ourselves and our planet. So let us join hands, friends, and even enemies, to ally together at this time of global crisis and a global alliance of virtues. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may this be God's will, inshallah. Thank you.
شكرا لفضيلة الحاخام دكتور روبن فايرستون.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Firestone,
for this
and
very
thank you
deep
for highlighting the common values between the Abrahamic religions.
Is the meaning.
Rabbi,
Also, it was important to look at the different experiences,
and the alliance
and
of
we do agree with you
what
the
we
results
all
that you
face
will
in
arrive
the
to
Abrahamic
is
family. And we know
it is not possible for all of us to have a common understanding.
To believe in the divine, and it is possible to share the same values. That could be our weapon in order to help us to live a good life and to be held responsible, and also to share the benefits. And this also applies when we're facing this coronavirus. Thank you very much, Dr. Firestone. And now I give the floor to Dr. Ibrahim Mashrouh, and I hope he is ready now.
تفضل دكتور إبراهيم.
Dr. Ibrahim, please go ahead.
دكتور إبراهيم تسمعونني؟
Dr. Ibrahim, can you hear us? Yes, I can. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. In the name of God, and may God's blessings be upon his prophet. Your Excellency, Sheikh Abdullah bin Baya, Your Excellencies, the sages, the scholars, may God's peace be upon you. I am starting this speech with poetry that basically means that I would have liked to be among you in person so that we can exchange views. However, it is not meant to be that we meet face to face and that we have to meet virtually. In my speech, I would like to explain that I hope that the spirit of the passengers of the ship is going to be my guidance because it was a very rough trip to reach where we are now. And we hope that using common grounds and common values and ethics we will be able to get to where we want to be. We hope that the silver lining of the pandemic is going to be an ethical revolution that will help us to lead the way together. And whenever we are faced by adversity, whenever we are faced by a calamity, we need to think and we need to draw conclusions in order to make things better in the future. That definitely applies to the corona pandemic. It has impacted the lives of every single one of us, and it has had really disastrous results and consequences for so many countries. However, this is a lesson for us to think about the life post this crisis and how we can use this crisis in order to make our life better in its aftermath. Human beings need to adopt a path of renewal, renewing their ethics, renewing their values and virtues. Islamic values in the past came usually in the form of sermons, and they were not always open to discussion. But now we need to have a dialogue that is based on the common grounds of virtues and humanity and ethics. That's why it's important to think about the central role that human beings play. A human being is always at the center, or should always be at the center of such discussions. At the moment, the human beings also have to face things like how digitalization and how artificial intelligence and other elements of technology can have an impact of one's life. And this is something that human beings need to resist. They have to exercise their own free will and not be under the control of digitization. And the renewal is not a matter of material renewal, it is also a matter of moral renewal. And the pandemic made it very clear that we have a common destiny and that we are all in the same boat. And following the pandemic, we are very much in need of a revolution of ethics. So to start with, we need to renew the focus on human rights. I apologize because the speaker is speaking on the phone, so it is not always very clear what he is trying to say. The sound is not always very clear. Human beings have been through a lot of experiences that led them astray from the right path, and having a revolution of ethics, rethinking our moralities is something that we need to do in the aftermath of this crisis. And the American poet T.S. Eliot tackled this issue in some of his poems. And maybe we do not need to be very pessimistic. Even before the corona pandemic started, there were philosophers who were very pessimistic about the future of humanity. However, we do not need to adopt this pessimistic view of the human destiny. We need to look at how we can break down the barriers. How we can move from thinking of a human being as a means to thinking of the human being as a goal. So a human being needs to enjoy dignity, and that requires us to look at a human being as the ultimate goal and not as a means to achieve a goal. Another thing is the digitization of everything and how this is becoming widely spread, especially with globalization. Technology is taking over, and it is bringing humans away from spirituality. Also, we need to look at the moral responsibility and the ethical responsibility of us all. Globalization cast aside the state and the countries. And in the global market, there are powers that are pushing globalization forward and leading human beings astray. If we think of Socrates, of Aristotle, and of other philosophers, we will conclude that human beings are responsible beings, and every act that we commit has its consequences. So having values is important because this guides the acts of human beings. And this helps human beings to act according to the principles of human dignity. When we look at the issue of responsibility, we can see that in some cases, human beings led to their own destruction through their acts.
وقد عبر هايدغر عن هذا الواقع بأن الإنسان هو راعي الوجود. بمعنى أنه هو الذي يحمل في لغته العالم، والعالم لغته شحنة من الوجود ويرعاه رعاية.
Human beings are stewards of this earth and they are part of this existence. Dr. Mashrouh, you have 2 minutes. Therefore, we need to go back to our instinct, to how we were created, to what is called in Arabic fitra. So, if a human being is tempted to commit an evil act, it is important to rethink this in the context of our fitra. This is where human values play a role, and also this is where laws play a role. So the status of ethics is very important. And maybe ethics, they have to do with doing good or what is right, following the right path. However, virtues, they have or they occupy a higher status. As human beings try to achieve good on this earth, they need religion, they need virtues. Because these values in themselves do not need any proof. Dr. Mashrouh, can you hear us?
الذي بشر برقم تحرير هذه العالم حيث نابت علوم مناب الرؤية الدينية التحليلية للعالم. إذا الدين ناب منابه العلم ورفع التسحير في تقدير الحداثة. لكن الذي لوحظ هو أن التسحير أعقده التسخير الرقمي والعقل الأداتي الذي بسط هيمنته على إرادة الإنسان وحريته. ينبغي تسديد الإنسان بناء على انتشار كينونته من الفردانية التي تعزله.
Human beings should resist the tendencies of individualism. They need to connect with their communities. And they should also resist giving up their free will to digitization and to technology. They need to exercise their will and not be led by technology. And such a crisis can help us to rethink things. The spirit of the passengers of the ship can help. Whether we are setting out or we are trying to reach the shore, this is something that requires us all to work together. We need solidarity and we need working together so that we can right the wrongs of humanity. Each one of us should feel responsible for the other. We need to be able to coexist because this is what will help us to live. Dr. Mashrouh, can you hear us?
شكرا للدكتور مشروح الذي وإن كان يعني
Thank you, Dr. Mashrouh. He was keen to be part of this session to analyze the moral dimension in our modern life and the importance of going back to ourselves to work under the principle of unity in our shared destiny and to have a revolution of ethics. He also explained and analyzed what ethics should guide us in this. I'd like to thank the distinguished guests and the scholars who have contributed to this session and enriched it with their interventions. This has been an example of what an exchange of ideas between religions and cultures can achieve, all in order to attend to the post-corona world. I'd like to thank you all. I'd like to thank those who followed this session. We are proud to think that those sessions are richer by their attendees and participants. We look forward to seeing you again tomorrow, starting at 4 p.m. Abu Dhabi time, and may God's blessings and peace be upon you.
Put a holding screen.